please enjoy this YouTube exclusive of Pimbo and Stringbean, a Tales from Tellis Saga prequel. Before the fall from Lunathal, there was Pimbo and Stringbean, a short story written and narrated by Christopher S. Carlone. If you enjoy this, think about picking up The Fall from Lunathal and other Tales from Tellis Saga books on Amazon or Audible. Part 1. A few days prior to the events of The Fall from Lunathal. The phrase "a hole in the wall" is sometimes used to describe an establishment of questionable quality. When used, the phrase rarely means an actual hole in a wall. The entrance to the Tin Teapot, on the other hand, was quite literally a hole in a wall. The small door, which had been forcibly removed from its hinges many years prior, remained a crude opening, no larger than the average gnome. Stringbean crawled his way across the muddy threshold. His long jacket dragged in globs of thick mud from the alleyway. It was tough work getting someone who stood almost 7 feet tall into the Tin Teapot, but after much vigorous wriggling, Stringbean managed to squeeze in. If the owner cared, he didn't show it. A grunt of displeasure was the only greeting the mustachioed barkeep afforded Stringbean upon his arrival. The barkeep had paling gray skin that tinted purple in the soft glow of the swinging lanterns over the bar. The Tin Teapot was nestled at the end of a dark alleyway between an old abandoned grain silo and a vacant guard tower. It was local opinion that the Tin Teapot was the worst drink hall in all of Avaria. For starters, anyone over 4 feet tall needed to crawl into the establishment to enter it. This was usually dirty business, given the amount of thick mud that layered the alleyways of Castle Avaria. Luckily, most of the patrons were under 4 feet tall. Only one regular customer could be seen scuttling into the Tin Teapot on a daily basis, but we will get to that in a moment. Being a primarily quarter-elf establishment, very few large folk ever frequented the Tin Teapot. The quarter-elves of Avaria, more frequently known as Avarian gnomes, were a people of mixed race, short stature, and rampant lactose intolerance. The gnomish people were the genetic melting pot of Tellis. They were a blend of Tellis's 3 most common races: the brave humans, stocky half-men, and the noble sun-elves. The breakdown of their ancestry did not exactly equal a quarter elven, but math wasn't considered very important to the gnomes of Avaria. The gnomes preferred to live in damp and warm places, usually underground, most likely a result of their half-men ancestry. Due to poor air circulation and cleanliness, the Tin Teapot was humid, moist, and certainly broke at least several city health regulations. The Tin Teapot's ale was sour, and its ambiance was nothing to write home about. Regardless, every gnome in the castle town knew of the Tin Teapot. Every gnome, and its one regular sun-elf. "I'll be having no more soliciting," the gnomish barkeep reminded Stringbean. "Folk here come to forget their worries, not get an earful of nonsense." "I'll have you know," came a voice from the low doorway. The accent was sing-songy and lighthearted, but with a rough, uneducated edge. "We are here to meet a customer, a paying customer." The voice did not come from Stringbean, but instead from a gnome. The newcomer brushed off his own long jacket, spraying mud all over the entryway. "We are here on official business, ain't that right, Stringbean?" the newcomer called, his pointed teeth forming a smile only a shark could love. Stringbean nodded. Stringbean didn't talk much. It didn't take words to beat someone to a pulp when they didn't pay up. The newcomer and his large friend crossed the drink hall, careful not to knock into the moldy wooden pillar that held up a large portion of the roof. That lone pillar was the main support of the ceiling and was clearly fighting a losing battle. The plank roof was slightly bowed, and raindrops plopped through the gaps onto the half-dozen tables. The barkeep snorted at the joyfulness of the newcomer. "Just 'cause you found someone boiling stupid enough to spend money on your scams don't mean you gotta conduct your business in this here reputable establishment, Pimbo Pintooth." Pimbo Pintooth, gnome conman and dastardly scam artist, brushed off the barkeep's foul rhetoric. Today was a day for money, not morally minded naysaying. The unlikely pair took a corner table adjacent to the moldy wooden pillar. Pimbo kicked up his feet, knocking some grime from his oversized boots onto the rickety table. "2 fishtail ales, if you don't mind." The gnome-sized stool groaned under Stringbean's weight as he hunched over to squat beside Pimbo. The barkeep sighed and plopped their drinks onto the table. A fishtail of questionable freshness bobbed in each of the wooden mugs. Pimbo took in the scent with his long, pointed nose. Say what you would about the Tin Teapot, but they had the best fishtail ale in all of Avaria. Salty, bitter, foaming, and frothing, with just that subtle hint of fish, the cherry on top, the good stuff. Stringbean slammed his drink down before Pimbo could even lift his own mug. Pimbo snorted and clapped his friend on the shoulder with a proud grin. "He's got that pintooth taste, that's for boiling sure." Pimbo smiled. "You can tell he was adopted by gnomes." Normally, an imperial sun elf would scoff at the lower class beverage. Stringbean was not like other sun elves. He had been raised by Pimbo's ma since he was only 6 feet tall. When Pimbo had first met Stringbean, he had been a sorry excuse for a sun elf. The poor oaf's name had been something long and distinguished, like Thaddeus von Flaresole III. I mean, honestly, who sees a baby and says, "Oh yeah, this guy needs like 4 names"? It was a real shame, since no one likes names over 2 syllables. They had fixed that quickly. Stringbean was the tallest, lankiest person Pimbo had ever seen. He was wearing green rags that made him look like some kind of orphaned green bean. He had been grimy, but not the good, muddy kind of grimy. Pimbo had taken the lonely sop under his wing, and the two had been inseparable ever since. They had been through thick and thin together. More thick than thin, to be frank. Stringbean waved for another ale. The big oaf was probably looking to drown out the realization that they were now wanted men. "He's an odd one, that's for boiling sure." The barkeep frowned. "Hey ya, do me a favor." Pimbo grabbed the barkeep's arm before the mustachioed gnome could leave their tableside. "We got a customer coming in here, real sucker type. We need everything to go perfect. If it does, we will be out of your hair. You won't see us again for the rest of your days. Do your part, play along, and some silver marks could make it in your pocket." The barkeep looked skeptical of the request. "Enough foul play goes on here in Castle Avaria. I won't be privy to your grifts and flimflams, Pimbo Pintooth." Pimbo sighed, let go of the barkeep's arm, and leaned back in his chair real casual-like. "Be reasonable, my friend. We always pay our tab, don't we?" Pimbo persuaded. "Do as I say, and you might be able to afford some hair on your head instead of having it all on your upper lip." The barkeep's mustache twitched like a furry caterpillar being prodded by a stick. When the barkeep showed no sign of budging, Pimbo eyed the pillar holding up most of the establishment. Plus, wouldn't want Stringbean here to get angry. Whole place could come tumbling down. Stringbean growled, trying his best to look intimidating behind a bowl of sandy golden hair. Truth was, the pair was not very intimidating. Just some nomads on the run from someone truly intimidating. Someone they had cheated out of a lot of money. Pimbo didn't know the particulars, only that they were wanted men now. By the law and by the underbelly of society. Wanted by guards and pirates and cutthroats alike. Someone had put the hit out on Pimbo and Stringbean. They just weren't really sure who. The barkeep only shook his head and returned to the bar. Pimbo was about to fire off another threat to play along when the tin teapot wobbled slightly. Their sucker had arrived. The boilin' fool was early. Of course he was. The bloke was desperate and weird. The perfect customer for Pimbo. The whole was soon eclipsed by a round man, attempting to scooch his way into the tin teapot. The middle-aged Avarian was sun-kissed, slightly balding, and rather obese. In Castle Lavaria, that meant he was well off. Thankfully, the slickness of the mud helped the man squeeze through the hole. "Terry!" Pimbo called in an inconspicuous whisper, waving the panting man over. "You are just in time." Terry's eyes darted back and forth, checking the establishment cautiously. It was early in the evening, so they were the only ones there. It was pretty perfect, just as all Pimbo's plans were, at least on paper. Terry took a seat, a blue scarf concealing all but the whites of his eyes, like a man trying to go incognito who had never before gone incognito. "Do you have it?" the Avarian whispered, eyes a reflection of paranoia, as though he had just robbed a bank instead of squeezed through a muddy hole. "Terry," Pimbo began, putting on his best entrepreneurial voice, "you are not gonna believe what I just got my hands on. An arcane elixir, lifted straight from the abandoned Citadel Astrani. Real dangerous stuff, you know. Not easy to come by, this potion I got here." Pimbo patted the jacket pocket at his chest. "We used to be a bigger group. Our raiding party who went to Citadel Astrani? Well, half of them were turned to toads." Terry's eyes went wide. Stringbean nodded solemnly at Pimbo's words before removing a spotted toad from his oversized pocket. The Sun Elf brute stroked the toad's head tenderly. "We'll find a way to break the curse, David," Pimbo promised the toad in Stringbean's hands. A tear streaked from Pimbo's eye as he made good use of the 2 acting classes Ma had gotten him during primary school. Terry shuffled uncomfortably at the idea that this toad had once been a man named David with hopes and dreams. Avarians, of course, were not folk who knew much of the arcane arts. This led many of them to be very superstitious about anything magical. There was no way Terry would have known that Pimbo had plucked that toad from a rice field 2 hours prior to their meeting. "Anyway," Pimbo continued, "I won't bore you with the sorrows of our efforts. I know you are in desperate need of this." Pimbo brandished a glass bottle. It was fine crystal, intricately designed and filled with a light blue liquid. The liquid sloshed inside, fizzing and sparkling, probably due to the fermentation. Terry's grin widened at the sight of the potion, displaying a few missing bottom teeth. "The Vanish Elixir," Pimbo whispered, hushed but excited. "Drink this, puppy, and in a few moments you'll vanish from sight, leaving behind only your shadow for the next hour." Pimbo placed the potion on the table and winked at the Avarian. It carries a fraction of Shades Arcana, very rare, so use the hour wisely. Terry nodded and snatched the potion. The man stood up hurriedly. Stringbean rose and loomed over him before the man could make a run for it. Aren't you forgetting something? Pimbo smiled. The barkeep snorted in the corner of the room, and Pimbo shot him a dirty look. I must be sure it works. Terry puffed out his chest, his whiny voice contrasting his attempt to look brave. I'll be drinking it here, and if I vanish, the money is yours. The man placed 30 gold and 5 silver marks on the table. Then, Terry uncorked the potion and downed it in a single gulp. The drink fizzed as it entered his mouth. He grimaced at the taste. That was when Pimbo stepped on the spark cracker he had placed under his boot while his feet had been kicked up. A pop deafened the patrons of the Tin Teapot as sparks and smog plumed from under the table. In a moment, the Tin Teapot was filled with a light gray smoke. When the smoke cleared and Terry was done coughing, Pimbo stood up. It was showtime. By the 4 gods! Pimbo cried, putting on the best acting he could conjure. It worked! It actually worked! Terry's boilin' gone! Stringbean looked around wildly, swinging his arms in the empty space of the bar to try and feel for Terry. Terry stood there, dumbfounded, looking at his own hands. But I can still see myself, Terry said dumbly. Pimbo's eyes went wide. Boilin' hells! Did you hear that, Stringbean? Stringbean nodded, trying his best to look frazzled. He's really gone! Pimbo began searching around the room. He purposely bumped into Terry and then took a defensive stance. I think I just bumped into him. Really? Stringbean asked, his voice low and slow. Yeah! Pimbo shouted. Terry, if you can hear me, you only have an hour. Go do what you gotta do. Terry, still seeming skeptical, approached the bar slowly. Pimbo's eyes met the barkeep. Pimbo pointed to the silver marks on the table subtly. The barkeep sighed. Terry hopped over the bar and began pouring himself an ale. Would you look at that? Pimbo shouted. That mug is filling itself up! Pimbo mimed kicking the pillar if the barkeep didn't play along. It's a miracle, the barkeep said in a half-uninspired flat tone. Guy could really use some acting classes. Luckily, Stringbean and Pimbo were putting up enough of a show. Terry smiled, downing his drink. He ran over to Stringbean and twisted his nose. Stringbean howled loudly, punching in the air with fury. The wild swings missed Terry. Some people considered Stringbean lacking in intelligence. However, the big oaf knew how to play his part in a scam. Terry giggled and gleefully scurried his way through the hole and out of the Tin Teapot. The last of the smoke drifted away, and the Tin Teapot went silent. When the coast was clear, Pimbo and Stringbean fell to the floor laughing. Pimbo approached the bar, wiping tears from his eyes. He placed the 5 silver marks and the toad on the counter. The toad let out a small croak. Keep the change, Pimbo laughed, skipping out of the Tin Teapot with Stringbean. Mind yourself, Pimbo Pintooth, the barkeep called, squirming toad in hand. One of these days, all this swindling of yours will come back to haunt you. Pimbo paid little heed to the warning. He and Stringbean now had enough money to leave Avaria and hit the sparkling sands of Goldfire. Wealth aplenty awaited. They would leave behind any worry of being pursued by whoever put the hit on them. Pimbo and Stringbean rounded the alleyway, tearing down a wanted sign with their faces on it. Bounty, it said. 15 gold marks for anyone who delivers the unnamed gnome and sun elf pair who stole from the Avarian barracks and then tricked some guards out of their socks last week. Outside, they could hear a beggar boy wailing that his panhandling cup had been stolen by a ghost. Pimbo approached the beggar boy and flicked a gold mark to him. "Did he buy it?" Pimbo asked. The beggar boy nodded. "Really thinks he's infishable." "It's invisible, kid," Pimbo corrected. "Go buy yourself some speaking lessons." Pimbo and Stringbean were laughing their stolen guard socks off as they hit the road. They were laughing so hard, they barely noticed the cloaked figure following them down the muddy streets of Castle Avaria. Part 2. Tate was a highwayman, a sellsword of types, a bandit, a crook, a murderer, and a deceiver. He had been that way since long before he met Arana and Captain Barnett. Tate had come from a long line of wickedness. Being raised by wicked parents usually makes someone wicked. Then, by surrounding yourself with other wicked folk, you can really augment your wickedness to the next level. In Tate's case, he was on a quest to be the wickedest of them all. He cared little for others' feelings. A clinical doctor might say Tate was a sociopath, that he lacked empathy. Sadly, nobody would ever know for sure, as the closest thing they had to a clinical doctor where he grew up was a donkey that kicked loose teeth out of your mouth and deemed it a dental extraction. In the beginning, Tate had liked the hyena and its crew. Thinking it would be nice to own the whole ship, he had challenged Black Eyes Barnett for captaincy. The resulting scar on his chin was proof that he still had a long way to go in his quest to become the most wicked in Tellis. It hadn't been all in vain, though. Black Eyes Barnett had been impressed with his style of dirty fighting and morally ambiguous crotch kicks. Black Eyes had made Tate one of his personal swords. "Find the little wretch who tricked me in last week's dice game," Black Eyes' right-hand woman had said. "His big pet moron, too. Death would be too easy for those two. I want them serving a lifetime of slavery," Arana had demanded. Tate, not accustomed to being sent on menial tasks, set off to track down the pair like a common errand boy. It was no matter, as they would all be calling him captain soon, even Arana. No one tricks the pirates of the hyena and lives to tell the tale. Crawling through a muddy hole wasn't Tate's style. He wasn't a filthy, sewer-dwelling quarter-blood. Tate was pretty surprised to see the big sun elf weasel his way in. He was even more surprised when that fat Avarian made it through too. Now there were too many people in there to do his business. Avarian guards didn't take kindly to pirate activity. Tate himself was already a wanted man. That balding Avarian soon squirmed his way back out through the hole and skipped down the alley. He hadn't seen Tate, but Tate had seen him. Seen him steal that beggar boy's earnings. The boy had acted like the panhandling cup was floating in thin air. Maybe the pathetic kid was partially blind, and that's why he was begging in the first place. It didn't matter. Tate wasn't here for strange fat men or beggar boys. He was here for the gnome and the sun elf. He would wait for the right moment. The streets of the castle town were crowded. Tate couldn't find his opening to apprehend the pair without alerting some of the locals. He stalked them silently for an hour, weaving behind a cart, then to a stack of barrels, then to a signpost like a black cat follows a mouse. It wasn't until the pair cleared the city gates that an opportunity showed itself. Being mid-evening, the gates were open, and the one guard on duty was dozing off against the stone wall. The other guards were probably having dinner somewhere instead of patrolling. That would have made Tate mad, but he hadn't paid his royal taxes in years, so who cared? The coast was clear. The merchants and travelers had all made their way into the castle town to sling their overpriced wares. It wasn't safe to travel at night in Avaria. Ogres and werebears were all but extinct, but being a coastal country, Avaria was still home to the most vicious creature of all, pirates. Apparently, this pair didn't fear the night, because they skipped right out of the city gates without a care. They probably felt themselves the predators. They were so wrong. The two chuckled their way down the country path towards Figsville Farms. The road would eventually lead them to Goldfire. Tate knew this because the gnome kept shouting about all the things they would do once they got to Goldfire. Tate had never been, but he was pretty sure they didn't actually give everyone complimentary massages upon entering the city, like the gnome was saying. These two would never make it to Goldfire, not before Tate got his hands on them. The gnome and the sun elf entered a small village at the edge of Oakfall Forest. If Tate was going to get a chance, now would be the time. Hiding behind a mill building, he would jump out and clobber them. The big one would sell for good money as a slave. Small one might be sold to a circus. Tate could carry them with one of the farmer's wheelbarrows. Easy enough. Tate was about to spring out from behind a tree when there was a scream from one of the larger buildings in the village. A naked fat man ran across the village. He was covering himself with a bucket, an arrow sticking from his hindquarters. He was half streaked with mud and scrambled his way down the road with the speed and grace only a slightly balding, middle-aged person with a bucket as clothes could conjure. The gnome and the sun elf burst out in laughter at the sight. The fat Avarian glanced their way and swore loudly, looking as though he would wring their necks if he could get the chance. The situation would have been funny if Tate had a sense of humor. Unfortunately, his taste in humor was as barren as that fat man's backside. The only thing Tate had a sense of was how long it had been since he had bathed and stabbed someone. About 2 weeks now, on both accounts. "Don't you ever come to this town again, Terry!" A farmer was yelling, bow in hand, wife looking horrified beside him. "Honestly, what kind of man enters a home, helps himself to your dinner, strips, and starts using your wash basin right in the middle of the living room?" A slamming sound, followed by more complaining, confirmed that the lone street was once again empty. Terry was long gone, just a disrobed speck on the horizon. The gnome and sun elf were preoccupied. The sun elf was laughing so hard he was leaning on the gnome, who was slapping at the sun elf to get off him. Tate moved with a swiftness that decades of wickedness had trained him for. He brandished his cutlass and made quick work of the big sun elf. A knock to the back of the head with the metal hilt sent the oaf sprawling over the gnome. "Stringbean, you moron! Get up!" The gnome grunted from under his friend's unconscious body. Tate loomed over them, a dark shadow in the setting sun. The chorus of woodland crickets was the only harmony for the gnome's noisy struggles. "Pimbo Pintooth," Tate began, voice like sandpaper, evidence of years spent smoking cinderleaf cigars. The gnome's eyes went wide at the sight of the shadow. "You made enemies with the wrong people. Your life is now forfeit." Tate's booted foot fell on the gnome's face with tremendous force. The gnome let out a whimper as his head lolled backward. After binding their hands and feet, Tate loaded the pair on the wheelbarrow. Tate always kept extra cloth wraps to conceal his face. He tied them around each of their mouths in case the pair got talkative. Tate then emptied their pockets of almost 40 gold marks, a few coppers, and an eccentric assortment of bits and bobs. Each trinket seemed to hold an unfulfilled promise. A music box, the inside made of flint which sparked if you wound it too fast. A few potions, which looked magical at first glance, but upon closer inspection were only filled with fermented red cabbage that had gone a light cyan in color. The Sun Elf had some large spheres of clay, painted terribly and marked in ink on the bottom. Real wyvern eggs. Tate snorted. These were the worst kind of con men. A classic example of the intellectually challenged preying on the slightly more intellectually challenged. Wouldn't matter now. Their life of crime had just been traded for a life of servitude. Captain Black Eyes Barnett would sell them as slaves or carnies somewhere across the Southmore Sea. Tate rolled onward, sneakily avoiding some Avarian guards outside the Castletown gates. Luckily, the guards were too busy to notice that Tate was transporting bound and unconscious foreigners in his wheelbarrow. The Avarian guards were preoccupied with arresting a nude and mud-streaked man with an arrow sticking from his rump. Tate made his way down the forest path to Orr's Rest. The hyena would be docked there just a little while longer while they resupplied. Another day, another job. Another mark of wickedness in his quest to become the most notorious cutthroat in Avaria. All in a day's work. Part 3. Pimbo was slowly coming to his senses after being knocked unconscious. This wasn't the first time that daylight had been forcibly struck from Pimbo, and it wouldn't be the last. The world can be a funny place when you take a good hit to the head. Everything seems downright goofy when it's spinning, hilarious even. The squirrels were funny. They carried around nuts and seeds like they were made of boiling gold. Didn't those idiots know you could find nuts and seeds practically anywhere? Pimbo giggled at the squirrels, and then at the clouds, and then at the trees. There were so many trees. They towered endlessly, rows and rows of solemn idiots, standing sentry like unpaid guards. Morons, real morons. Just waving there in the breeze, their only salary the rain and sunlight. Rain and sunlight, nuts and seeds. These things were free. Pimbo was rich in them. It was pretty much the only thing Pimbo was rich in now. He was fairly certain his gold marks had been taken by the person wearing the boot that had stomped on his face. Pimbo's senses returned to him as they rolled onward. He was beginning to remember that, disappointedly enough, the world was actually not so funny. The world was rather painful. His head throbbed, and his eye was swelling up where he had received a year's worth of heal to face. No, the world wasn't so funny. It was a bit cruel. Pimbo had finally made enough marks to get out of Dodge and hit the sun-soaked streets of Goldfire. Once inside the Imperial walls, and once finished with his complimentary massage, he would sell enough trinkets to open up a reputable shop. Pimbo would have settled down with a nice wife named Hilda or something. She would cook him salty fish stew and rub his feet each night. He would yell at his kids to keep it down. His kids would have honorable quarter-elf names like Rupert and Lumpy. Little troublemakers, those two. Always getting into scuffles, especially at school. One day, though, Rupert was going to be a great artist, Pimbo thought fondly. He wished Lumpy would find a passion like Rupert did with art. Then Pimbo remembered he didn't have a shop in Goldfire, or kids, or a wife named Hilda who made him salty fish stew and rubbed his feet. Who was he kidding anyway? No matter how much he dreamed, he wouldn't do any of that junk. He would continue scamming until there was no one left to scam in all of Tellis. Pimbo was having a difficult time distinguishing reality from delusional fantasy. His face just hurt so much. Pimbo was pretty sure he did have a family, though. It was a family he was born to, not one he had made himself, but it was a family. He had a ma and a pa, and then there was his sister, Helfie. His parents would be fuming if they could see another one of his business exploits go belly up. Helfie didn't partake in his scams so much anymore. She had declared she would go the righteous route, working as a bouncer in the quarter-elf taverns of Orr's Rest. It was a noble endeavor, but it didn't pay enough to get their family out of their lower sewer apartment. Nope, Pimbo wasn't rich in anything at the current moment. All he had now was over 200 pounds of sturdy sun elf drooling on top of him. Eventually, the sounds of the tranquil woodland path were overtaken by the merry ambiance of a waking seaside village. Pimbo knew the smell instantly. His lilac-gray nostrils twitched as they took in the reminiscent scent of salt and brine. He was back in his hometown of Orr's Rest. The hopes of being rescued by someone who recognized him was bagged as soon as a literal bag went over his head. Helfie was probably sleeping right now anyways, since she worked nights. And what would Ma do? The lady was a regular imperial fencer with a wooden spoon, but that wouldn't help right now. Not against this guy, whoever he was. Pa would be off fishing, trying to bring home the bacon. Bacon flounder, to be exact. A particular breed that circled the coast of the Southmore Sea. It tasted like bacon if you fried it long enough. Good stuff, actually. Pimbo drooled at the thought, trying to take his mind off the fact that no one was coming to save him. That boil-in shadow with the iron boot had knocked out Stringbean with amazing dexterity. That was no small feat. Stringbean had once wrestled a bull and made the poor thing tap out. There wasn't many who could beat the living daylights out of old Stringbean. Whoever this guy or gal was, they weren't dealing with small potatoes here. For the life of him, Pimbo just couldn't recall who he had scammed to make them angry enough to damage Pimbo's amazingly proportional and traditionally handsome face. Whoever it was, they had blacklisted him in the underworld. Would-be bounty hunters and sellswords had been crawling around Avaria for him ever since the bounty went up. It was partially the reason he and Stringbean were hastening to Goldfire. The terrain underneath the wheelbarrow became rougher as they rolled upward across a wooden plank. Seagulls and clock tower bells sounded off in unison to signify dawn's arrival. It was an odd experience, hearing and smelling your hometown, but not being able to see it. Like coming home in a dream, only to wake up with a bag on your head. The wheelbarrow came to an abrupt stop. Pimbo was picked up from the wheelbarrow. He hated being picked up. Every gnome did. He wriggled with passionate fury, an instinct no doubt formed from years of bullying for his height in primary school. Pimbo bit through the wrap at his mouth with his sharp teeth. "Hey!" he shouted. "What gives? Don't you know never to pick up a gnome?" Pimbo was dropped roughly onto creaking wood. Cold steel pressed against his neck as the bag came off. Looming over Pimbo were a half-dozen of the roughest, scallywagging scallywags Pimbo had ever seen. They were Avarians. Their skin was familiar with sun, and their hair was ragged and windswept. Standing at the front were two intimidating figures. One was a handsome woman. She had a scar running down her chin, and her almond-shaped eyes indicated she was from somewhere across the Southmore Sea. Her dark hair outlined her face like a perfect portrait. Pimbo recognized her. He had played cards with her at the Rusty Alehouse a few weeks back. Lost to her fair and square. What did she have to complain about? There was no way she would have seen Stringbean lifting her spare coin pouch, right? It hadn't even been that much money. Just 2 gold marks and a silver. The money had been enough to purchase some red cabbage and some fancy-looking bottles, though. "You stole from the wrong person, Pimbo Pintooth," the woman spat. "No one steals from Arana and gets away with it. Not without the rest of their days being pure torture." Arana. Most Avarians had heard the stories. She was one of the best sword duelers on the west coast of Tellis, and she currently had her cutlass tickling the edge of Pimbo's chin. Arana, the best boiling sword in Avaria. Famous brigand and partially responsible for the hyena being a household name in the coastal villages. If he had known that, he would have told Stringbean to keep away from her coin purse. Pimbo stuttered, trying to think up a way to get himself out of this one. "Good job, Tate." Arana nodded to the gnarled man beside her. The man had a bandana concealing half of his face, and Pimbo deemed that a good thing. The portion Pimbo could see was more than enough. Guy definitely wasn't winning any beauty pageants anytime soon. "These two are scammers." Tate's voice was as ugly as he was, hoarse and raspy. Guy wouldn't be doing opera performances anytime soon either. "They had trinkets with them. A spark cracker. Just a cotton ball lined with flint shavings, coating an inner layer of gunpowder. If you cracked it, you would lose some fingers. They also had a jar full of beans that said, 'Beans of grow 2 inches.'" Tate had pulled out the pouch carrying Terry's money. "They had this, though. That's a decent amount of marks for some lowly conmen." He knelt over Pimbo, his own curved blade prodding the gnome in the chest. "Where did you get it? Trick that fat man out of his clothes and his purse." Pimbo stammered, not wanting to sell out Terry. The guy had most certainly suffered enough, running around nude when he thought no one could see him. Getting shot in the backside by an arrow. That had to make using the privy a nightmare for the next couple weeks. No doubt Terry's social reputation had taken a hit from the stunt. The cutthroat's knife floated above Stringbean's unconscious body. "Tell me, or I add your friend's ears to my collection," Tate hissed. At the man's belt dangled 2 sets of dried-out sun elf ears, or some very convincing clay replicas. Revolting, Pimbo thought, and that was coming from the guy who grew up in a sewer. "If I tell you, you promise not to hurt Stringbean?" Pimbo asked. Tate grinned, his teeth looking like 2 uneven rows of dried-out sweet corn. "Pirate's honor," Tate promised. "Tell us, and if it pays off, I'll make sure you get sold as slaves to a circus and not some western warlord," Arana snickered. "His name's, Lumpy," Pimbo lied. "He works for an Avarian herbal potion maker in an old restored bar. It's located right between the old guard tower and the grain silo on Oakfall Street." Tate grinned. "You lie about this, you die, gnome." Pimbo nodded. "Ain't lying, honest. Poor sap keeps his payment right there, under the wooden beam in the center of the place. I'm not sure it's much, but it might be worth a look. Kick that pillar down and the floorboard will come up, revealing his personal chest." "Show us, just to be sure." Arana presented a map of Castle Avaria. Pimbo reluctantly pointed on the map to the castle town where the tin teapot was. Arana seemed satisfied by this. This was a gamble. If the beam came down and killed Tate, would the crew of the hyena seek out the highwayman, or would they just leave without him? It was risky, but Pimbo in his right mind couldn't sell out Terry. The barkeep, on the other hand, Pimbo could care less about that guy. "You would know him if you saw him?" Arana asked Tate.
"Can't forget him if I tried. I saw too much of him to ever forget," Tate grimaced. "He was being arrested. Shop will be empty. Ripe for plundering."
Arana snickered. "Go back and raid the shop. Take everything of value and come back here before we're off." Tate set off, and Arana led Pimbo and Stringbean to the brig. The creaky ship bobbed from side to side, causing dirty water to slosh around the lower level. "Stay put and don't make too much noise, or I'll personally remove your vocal cords," Arana threatened. Pimbo looked around the brig. Large rusty iron bars were stamped into the wood from midship to the bow. Pretty spacious for a brig. Pimbo hardly noticed the huddled figure in the corner. A wretched-looking old guy on a mat. Guy looked like he had been here for years. If he was alive, it didn't show. He just lay there on a damp mat like a soggy pile of skin and bones. Pimbo gulped. He had to get them out of this place. Ma would be worried. Worried sick? Well, not really worried sick. More like worried slightly unwell. Pimbo usually disappeared for weeks at a time when he was on the run from the local authorities. "Stringbean!" Pimbo slapped his friend. "Wake up! We are in a real pickle here!" Stringbean groaned and awoke. He was bleary-eyed and confused, and he swung at the air frantically.
"Bad man, go away!"
Stringbean shouted, then gripped his head and winced.
"Oh man, my head hurts real bad like, Pimbo,"
Stringbean complained. Pimbo sat back, relieved his friend didn't seem to be made dumber by the knockout. A loss of any more brain power for Stringbean would be detrimental. It would be like robbing a homeless person of his last copper mark. At that point, Pimbo might as well befriend one of the dental donkeys in town. Brigands and cutthroats laughed and sang, barked orders and cackled to one another above deck. This was not good. They were in a tight spot. Again. Things like this always happened to Pimbo. He was starting to think a life of tricks and crime wasn't exactly paying off. Pimbo closed his eyes, trying to bring himself back to the imaginary life with his beloved bride Hilda and their good-for-nothing freeloading sons. Stringbean began snoring from beside him. Soon it was morning. A day felt like a week in this moldy brig. It would be best to act before Tate returned, or they set sail. The bag of bones on the mat would occasionally let out a wheeze that sounded like his last. Pimbo thought it would be smart to try to convince a deckhand to open the cell and remove the dead guy. Then Stringbean would pounce. They would have a better shot taking out a deckhand than Arana. Pimbo would bite the deckhand, and Stringbean would pummel him. Yeah, that just might work. Pimbo was pretty sure the guy on the mat wasn't dead, maybe just narcoleptic or something. Either way, Pimbo would lie and say he had gold in his pants to get someone in here. But Pimbo had no way of knowing that Tate never made it to the Tin Teapot. Instead, Tate had found a prize worth far more than a few silver under a floorboard. Evening came, and they were brought a few meager scraps of bread and 3 apple cores by a deckhand. Pimbo tried to tell the deckhand to check on the dead guy, but he was ignored. They wouldn't be getting out of this one so easily. Pimbo took a seat on a free mat beside Stringbean, far away from the smelly mat man. He dozed in and out of sleep, dreaming of a life where he didn't have to rely on tricks to be loved. A life where maybe he could have his own crew. That would be nice. A group of friends who liked him for him, and not because they had to, like his family. They would laugh at his jokes because they cared about him, not his money or his expert schemes. Once again, evening turned to morning. The hours crawled by, slower than the slugs that traced the wooden floors of the brig. Then there were shouts from the upper deck, laughing and jeering from Arana. Tate hauled two pale figures down the lower deck stairs. Two of the strangest-looking, pointy-eared people Pimbo had ever seen were thrown into the brig. One had a bag over his head. The other had curly hair the color of lavender. Pimbo decided to keep quiet and observe. These outsiders must have been from far away. They didn't resemble any gnome Pimbo had ever seen. The pair also didn't look like the Sun Elves from Goldfire, nor the Half-Men from Moonglow and Naltharim. They couldn't be northern humans, as they had two pointed ears. "Just like home," the female elf said nervously, as Tate walked up the ladderway. Pimbo lurked in the corner, watching closely as the male elf let out muffled groans. Okay, don't make me regret this, Otter Boy. Don't start screaming, just hold still," the female said. She removed the bag to reveal a scruffy-haired young man with a round face and a small nose. The young elf spat out his gag. "Oh, say Luna above, the smell! Put the bag back on!" the young elf groaned. Pimbo smiled. He liked these two already. He couldn't describe why, but they seemed like trustworthy folk. Little did Pimbo know, this meeting would alter the course of his and Stringbean's life forever. Pimbo had no way of knowing that these two elves were being pursued by something much more dangerous than pirates. Thank you for listening to this prequel. Find out what happens next in The Fall from Lunathal, Tales from Tellis, Book 1. You can listen to Book 1, 1.5, and 2 on Audible now. Book 2.5, Silverhart, will be releasing spring of 2024. If you would like a signed copy, visit www.christophercarlone.com. The link will be in the description. Thank you for listening, and remember, life is a gift.